Hi, it's me, Kat, again, and we're going to be working on one of our blocks from Getting to Know You, Block of our Month quilt. So this month we're going to be working on block number 3, Getting to Know Magenta. And after you have all of your pieces cut, they should look like this. And we're going to be piecing 2 blocks this month. So I'm going to head over to the machine and get it set up, and we'll get started on piecing. So the first unit we're going to piece is going to be our stitch and flip square in a square. And the author tells us to draw a line diagonally down our pink weave 1 and I think they're 3/4 inch squares, and also our background square. But I have a time saver for you. Instead of marking all of these little rectangles, squares, I find that I can save a lot of time if I just press my squares on the diagonal with the wrong sides together. And then when we place that square, right sides together, on our background square, we are going to be stitching in that little ditch of our fold that we've pressed. And once we've stitched that, and I'll tell you another little tip, if you can see over here, instead of a 1/4 inch foot on my machine or a regular foot, I have an open toe foot, or sometimes called a craft foot. And that allows me to get perfect placement as I'm stitching down that groove that I've pressed. So I'm going to show you how you want to pin this. So when you are putting your square on your square, right sides together, I'm going to pin in 2 places. I'm going to pin close to this point and close to this point. And what that does is it keeps my square from pivoting. And so that way I start on the corner and I end on the corner, and then I get a perfect diagonal stitched line. Once you've sewn that, and you are going to just press that back up. Now, since I've already pre-pressed these, look at how perfect that is and how beautiful that is. Because that wants to press right where it was pressed to begin with. So when you get the first corner sewn on and in place, we have to remove this excess corner here before we can place the next square. So on this sample here, I've already removed that corner off the back of my dark purple square, magenta square, and pressed that first corner out. Now I've placed my second square and I've stitched in the ditch, and now I'm going to press this into place. And here's our 1/4 inch seam allowance we're going to need for the next step. So before I can place my third square, I'm going to have to come in here and trim my excess off of this corner. Now, you can take this to the cutting mat and use a ruler if you want, but it's a seam allowance. Nobody's ever going to see it, so just take your scissors and trim it off. And now we can rotate it and we're ready to put the third corner on. So let me finish these units and then we'll see what we're going to do next. And here are our stacked diamond units. Now I've got 4 here for the first block I'm putting together. And the only thing I want to point out, make sure that you have the background fabric on one end consistently on all of your units. And the other thing is, I don't typically press seams open when I'm doing patchwork, but there are instances where it makes a big difference, and this is one of those times. So you're definitely going to want to press the seam open so that you don't have a lot of bulk in the seam right here where these 2 points have to come together. And notice that they nest beautifully, and I haven't sewn my points off at all. We've got lots of seam allowance there so that we've got pretty diamonds. Okay, so the next part are going to be our half square triangle units. So I'll get those pieced and then we're going to start putting it all together. So here is our half square triangle unit. We're going to be placing a pink weave fabric right sides together with the magenta bubble. Draw a line down the center diagonal of one of your fabrics. You're going to sew 1/4 inch on either side of that center line. Then you want to make sure that you're going to take this and press it before we cut it. It's going to help set that thread, and also because we are stitching on the diagonal down 2 sides, usually we go down one side, spin it around and come back the other. Sometimes you distort the weave of your fabric. So if you press that out before you cut it, everything's gonna turn out really nice. So here is our half square triangle unit pieced. We're gonna press to the darker fabric, which is the magenta bubble. And then we need to take and trim this down to 2 7/8 inch square. So make sure when you do that, you end up with the 2 fabrics meeting exactly in opposite corners. And one way to do that is to use that beautiful new block lock ruler, which I forgot to bring home. But I will make sure that I bring it home and have it for the demo for next month. But in the meantime, you can use any square ruler. Just make sure that your 2 fabrics meet right in that corner. So, all right, we are going to be putting our triangle corner units together, and then I'll meet you right back here and we'll see how it all fits together. For those of you who would like to see how we want to go about trimming up these half square triangle blocks, we'll do this last one here together. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just looking at this diagonal line that I have on my ruler, my square ruler, and I'm going to make sure that that is riding right over my seam. And then I'm going to look over here and make sure that I'm beyond my 2 7/8 mark. And I'm just inside my 3 inch mark, so let's see if I can cut this and not interfere with the camera. So I'm going to trim my first 2 sides. There we go. And now I'm going to rotate my block. So I've trimmed these 2. I'm going to rotate my block. And now I'm going to trim my last 2 sides. Now that I have these 2 sides trimmed, I'm going to again be looking at that diagonal line. Make sure it's laying right over my seam between this half and this half. And now I'm going to be looking at my 2 7/8 marks on both my horizontal and my vertical axis. And now I'm going to take and trim up my last 2 sides. And there, we've got a perfect square. And again, our seam with our 2 colors meet in the corners, opposite corners. All right, let's head back to the machine. So here is our triangle corner unit. It consists of this large half square triangle here, not half square, a large triangle, 2 smaller triangles of our background, and the half square triangle that we pieced earlier. So we need to attach our background triangles to our half square triangle unit. So what you're going to do is, I chose to put this triangle on this side first. So we're just going to lay this, line up your top edge and your right edge that forms a 90-degree angle here. And notice that we have this triangle of our background fabric hanging off. Don't worry about that. That's perfectly fine, and we need that. And I'll show you how it turns out in the next step. So then we're going to press this seam out towards the triangle. It's going to look like this. And now we need to put the other triangle onto the other side of our magenta bubble. So here is the first triangle that we placed. Now we're going to place the second triangle along the other side of our magenta bubble. And again, we're going to line up our straight side here and here. That forms our 90 degrees. And then look what happens when we place these together. We end up with both of our little tips hanging off. So we sew our 1/4 of an inch. And when we press this out, which we're told to press these out away from our half square triangle that we pieced, now we have this beautiful long straight line all the way down these two triangles, and that's exactly what we want. So that's why those tips have to hang off, so that it'll end up giving us this nice straight edge. And now we have a perfect triangle. Okay, now we're going to sew the other half of our unit on next. So my only tip or suggestion to you on this last step of our triangle corner units is I would place my pieced triangle on top of my magenta bubble triangle. And of course, you're going to want to, I'm always going to pin my corners because I don't want them getting out of position as my foot is coming down that seam, because it is on the bias. The reason I like to place my pieced fabric on top is so that I can keep my eye on this intersection here. I want to make sure that I'm not sewing that tip of my unit on the other side off. So if for some reason I haven't sewn precisely in a prior step, this is where I can make adjustments in my stitching line and make sure that my block looks like it was pieced perfectly, whether it was or not. So that's what seam allowances are for. So when we unpin this, and we are going to make a total of 8 of these units, and we're going to be pressing our seam allowance towards our solid magenta bubble fabric. And there is our unit, and it's beautiful. Love it. All right, so here I've laid out our entire block, and we are going to place our pieced triangle units in each 4 corners. We're going to put our stacked diamond units north, south, east, west, and we have 1 square in the middle. You're going to be sewing your block into rows. So I've got row 1 here, row 2, and row 3. Your center row, you're going to be pressing your seams towards your center square, because that's going to lay really nice and flat. Row 1 and row 3, you're going to be pressing toward your large magenta circle triangle. That way, this block is going to lay as flat as it can be. All this piecing right here is going to just lay nice and flat. Once you have your 3 rows, now I'm going to go ahead and put my 3 rows together, and my block will be almost complete. We'll just have to attach our borders and then trim it up. So I'll be right back. At this time, I would like to show you my method of pinning. So I've got my row 1 and row 2 pinned together. I am actually, it doesn't really matter which one's on top or which one's not, but I've pinned it so that my middle row is underneath. The absolute minimum that I would pin would be at the beginning and of course at the end, and then we definitely want to pin where our block seams meet. Let's see if you can, hope you can see that. Let me put it under the light here. So we have alternating seam allowances. This seam allowance goes to the left and the one underneath goes to the right. So this is how I pin those. I'm going to line up that seam, and because their seam allowances are going in opposite directions, I can push them together and I can feel them lock. And it's nice and flat, no bumps. I place my pin directly in front of the seam here. My pin is directly in front of it or above it as it's going through the machine. So if I were going to be sewing from this side, I would have pinned on this side of my stitching line. But I'm going to have this up. I want to make sure that this pin secures my line up that I just carefully lined up. I want to make sure that that pin is going to hold it until I stitch through it. That way it can't slip on me. So then I'm going to, this is the second intersection that I want to make sure is secured. So my pin is directly in front of it or above it. Now, this is a very long section in through here, and I do have some piecing on the underside, this seam that we've pressed open. I don't want this to get flipped back underneath and have to pick it out. So I'm going to stick a pin right here, and I'm going to secure that seam allowance so that it can't flip down. Notice, and this happens a lot in piecing, people think, oh, I did something wrong. Well, fabric stretches. So if you can see, I've got a little bubble right here in this middle section of my 2 rows that I'm putting together. And what I'm going to do is I'm sewing this, as I'm stitching it, I'm going to gently, and I mean just very gently, put a little tension on that as I sew it, and they're going to nest together. And once the block is pieced and pressed and blocked again, we'll have a beautiful flat block. So let me piece this this seam right here. And I'm using a 1/4 inch foot with a little flange. So what I like to do is just take my finger and pop it under there. So here is that point. I don't want to sew off, so I'm just watching that, and that is going to finish nicely there. Just pop that pin right under that flange as I'm going. And we're done. Let's see how this looks. I really like my intersections to match up like they're supposed to. And let's see what this one looks like. That looks pretty darn good. And I really like that too. That looks great. Let's see how we did on our points. So I've got a nice point here. Got a nice point there. Another nice point. And another nice point. So I'm going to go ahead and take this to the iron and press it, And then I'm going to put my last row on here, and then we'll put our borders on. One last quick word about sewing our 3 rows together. And as far as pressing, which way are we going to press those seams? It doesn't tell us in the directions. And what I've decided to do is I am going to press these seams towards the outside. And the reason is I only have 2 little bulky areas right here in the center, because all of these are able to lie flat. But I have 2, 4, 6, 8 points that would be folded on themselves and would make a really bumpy center strip here. So I've chosen to press these seams towards the outside so that I only have 2 little bumpy areas right here. But it really doesn't look bad from the front. I just went in there and pressed really well from the back side as well. Also, one other quick word about sewing over pins. I know a lot of people are worried about sewing over pins. What I'm going to say is I'm using these very fine, gotta find the camera here, where are you? I am using these extremely fine, and I can't remember the number because I don't have the package here, quilting pins that I sell at the shop. And I will make sure that I show you the package next month. These pins are so thin that if you accidentally hit one with your needle, the pin's gonna bend. That's how pliable these pins are. So you're not gonna hurt your sewing machine. At worst, you'll dull your needle and you'll have to change your needle. But if you really want to improve your piecing skills and you are looking for precision where you're lining up blocks, then I'm going to highly suggest that you do use a very thin quilting pin and you sew over them. You leave them in your work until you have sewn through that pin, then remove it, because that's the only way you're going to ensure that things don't shift on you as you're sewing. Okay, I'm going to put the borders on this block and then trim it up and we'll be done. I hope you've enjoyed this video and it's given you a few tips on some things that aren't in the book, piecing tips, pressing tips, pinning tips, things like that. I really enjoyed putting this block together. This is probably one of my favorites so far, but I look forward to putting together our block 4 next month. So see you right back here. Thanks. Happy quilting.